What are drag-along rights? How do they work? And should you include them in your company's documents? I'm Malcolm Zoppi, an English qualified solicitor, and in this video, we'll discuss what are drag-along rights. We'll also go over the differences between drag-along and tag-along rights and discuss the advantages and disadvantages of using drag-along provisions. Fantastic, let's get started. So, chapter 1 is what are drag-along rights? Drag-along rights are contractual provisions often found in a shareholders agreement or in the company's articles of association that enable majority shareholders to force minority shareholders to also sell their shares to a third-party buyer. So they drag along minority shareholders to sell their shares to someone else. So essentially, when a majority shareholder receives an offer to sell their shares, they can exercise drag-along rights to require that the minority shareholders also sell their shares to that third-party buyer. And typically, a majority shareholder will want to have these provisions in their company's documents because if they want to sell the entire company and the buyer wants to buy the entire company, they don't want to rely on hopefully the minority shareholder is going to be willing to sell their shares and is going to be happy to sell the shares at that price. Instead, by simply adding drag-along provisions in your company's documents, the majority shareholder can force the minority shareholder to sell their shares in their business sale. Fantastic. Moving on to chapter 2, which is the differences between drag-along and tag-along rights. So we've just discussed drag-along, so now let's define tag-along rights. In short, they enable minority shareholders to veto a share sale by a majority shareholder unless that buyer also offers to buy the minority shareholder's shares on the same terms. Okay, so let's run through the key 3 differences between tag-along and drag-along provisions. The first is that tag-along rights benefit minority shareholders, whilst drag-along rights benefit majority shareholders. Secondly, tag-along rights give the option to minority shareholders to sell their share to a buyer, whilst drag-along rights or provisions force minority shareholders to sell their shares to that buyer. And lastly, tag-along rights exist to avoid the minority shareholders being left behind and having a stranger as a new majority shareholder, whilst drag-along rights exist to not jeopardize a potential business sale. And this is because typically a buyer of a business usually wants to buy all of the shares of the company, not just those of the majority shareholder. Before we discuss the advantages and disadvantages of using drag-along rights, feel free to email me if looking for professional legal advice. With our legal advice calls, there are no charges, no obligations, and no nonsense. Contact me now at info@zopping.co.uk. Fantastic. Let's move on to chapter 3, which is the advantages and disadvantages of drag-along rights. Starting with the advantages. There are 3 main ones that I can think of. Number 1, typically there's a lower risk of a business buyer walking away from a potential purchase of a business due to a minority shareholders not wanting to sell their shares. That's because, as we mentioned, with drag-along rights, you can drag along a shareholder whether they want to sell their shares or not, and therefore, the risk for the buyer of not being able to buy the entire company is virtually eliminated. Secondly, it's typically easier for a buyer to complete a business purchase because they don't have to liaise and negotiate separately with each of the company's shareholders, and that typically decreases, again, the risk, and therefore, a seller could demand a higher price for the business. Which brings us to the third advantage. There's a potential for a higher valuation because the buyer is taking on less risk and therefore might be willing to pay more for that business. But of course, there are also going to be disadvantages. The first one being that the minority shareholders may not be very happy and therefore bring an unfair prejudice claim. Secondly, it adds procedural burdens and may increase professional fees because typically solicitors will usually be involved to help enact the drag-along provisions, and therefore, of course, you have to pay them, and that increases costs. And lastly, it may discourage investors from investing in the company if they see that there are drag-along provisions that can be enforced against them. So that's how drag-along rights work in practice. Now, if you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below. I promise I will answer any questions that you may have. And if you want to learn more about tag-along rights, the sister or brother to drag-along rights, make sure to watch this video right here. Thank you for watching.